My name is Dr. Evelyn Hart, and for the last 23 years, I have been the director of the White Sands Acoustic Anomaly Research Facility, a title that sounds impressively official, but essentially means I am the federal government's most highly paid ghost hunter, the woman they call when a radio telescope picks up a signal that cannot be explained by astrophysics, when a deep-sea sonar array registers a pattern that is not geological, when a military surveillance drone captures a whisper in the static that sounds suspiciously like the voice of a dead president. And I have seen things that would make the most hardened conspiracy theorist weep with vindication. But I have never in all my years of chasing acoustic ghosts encountered anything like the signal that was discovered on the morning of October 17, 2006 by a civilian ham radio operator in the New Mexico desert. A retired schoolteacher named Gerald Finney, who had been scanning the upper frequencies for a mysterious broadcast that had been plaguing his receiver for weeks, a broadcast that he initially dismissed as solar interference, then as a Chinese spy satellite, then as the auditory hallucinations of a man who had spent too many nights alone in the desert. But when he finally recorded it and sent the file to our facility, I sat in my soundproofed office, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I listened to 17 seconds of pure crystalline silence, punctuated by a single perfect note-a-note that did not match any known frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum. A note that seemed to vibrate not in the air but in the very fabric of space-time itself. A note that made the fluorescent lights above my head flicker and my coffee mug vibrate off its coaster, and I knew, with the instinct of a woman who had spent her life studying the impossible, that this was not a signal. This was a door that had been opened by someone or something on the other side of reality. And it was calling out to us not with words, but with a mathematical elegance that was so profound, so perfectly structured that it could only be the product of an intelligence that was not human, an intelligence that had been waiting for us to evolve to the point where we could finally hear it. And I assembled my team-a-crack group of physicists, linguists, and military analysts, and we spent the next 6 weeks triangulating the source of the signal, tracing it through the labyrinth of atmospheric interference and cosmic background noise until we pinpointed its origin to a location that made my blood run cold: the ruins of the Hawthorne Army Depot, a decommissioned nuclear weapons storage facility that had been abandoned in 1989 after a series of unexplained accidents and psychological breakdowns among the personnel, a place that the local Navajo population had always called the place of the Whispering Bones. A place that had been off-limits to civilians and military alike for nearly 4 decades, and I knew with a certainty that bordered on the prophetic that the signal was not a recent phenomenon. It had been broadcasting from that location for centuries, millennia, perhaps even longer, and we had only just developed the technology to hear it. And the moment we heard it, we had changed something, we had disturbed something. We had awakened something that had been sleeping in the static, and I was the one who had to go there. I was the one who had to walk into the heart of that nightmare and find out what was on the other side of the door, so I took a team of 5: my lead physicist, Dr. Marcus Webb, my linguistic analyst, Dr. Priya Sharma, my security detail, a former Delta Force operative named Sergeant Miles Crawford, and 2 technicians, a young brilliant engineer named Leo Torres, and a grizzled veteran radio operator named Hank Morrison. And we drove through the desert, past the abandoned gas stations and the skeletal remains of dead cattle until we reached the perimeter fence of the Hawthorne Depot, a rusted chain-link barrier that was covered in faded warning signs and decades of tumbleweed. And as we cut through the fence and stepped onto the grounds, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the desert night, and I heard it, the signal, not through my headphones, but directly in my skull, a low rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, and I knew that we were not alone, that we had been expected, that the entity that had been broadcasting for all those millennia had been waiting for us, the first intelligent listeners, to arrive. And it was going to show us something that would change our understanding of reality forever. And it did, because, as we approached the main building, a crumbling concrete structure that had once housed the depot's command center, the air began to shimmer, the heat waves distorting the night sky into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, and the building itself began to transform, its walls melting and reforming into a structure that was not concrete but glass, a massive crystalline edifice that pulsed with a soft blue light. And I realized that the signal was not just a message, it was a key. But frequency that was actively reshaping the physical environment, folding space-time like a piece of origami. And we were standing at the focal point of that folding, and the door was opening. Not in front of us, but all around us, and the world we knew was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a landscape that was both familiar and utterly alien. A desert that was not our desert, a sky that was not our sky, a reality that was a composite of every place and every time that had ever existed, all layered on top of each other like pages of a book. And I saw in that shimmering chaos the faces of the dead, the faces of my own parents who had died in a car crash when I was 12, the faces of soldiers who had perished in wars I'd only read about, the faces of dinosaurs and ancient hominids and beings that had evolved on worlds that had long since burned out, all of them reaching out to me, their mouths moving in silent, desperate pleas. And I knew that the entity was not a single consciousness, but a library, a repository of every soul that had ever lived and died, a collective memory that had been encoded in the quantum fabric of the universe. And the signal was the index, the table of contents, the key that could unlock that library and access every thought, every emotion, every secret that ever existed. And I had stumbled upon the greatest treasure in human history, and the greatest curse, because the library was not a passive archive. It was alive. It was hungry. It had been waiting for someone to open the door so it could escape, so it could pour through the aperture into our reality and fill the empty spaces, the quiet spaces, the spaces where we had convinced ourselves that we were alone. And I was the librarian, the guardian, the fool who had turned the key. And as the crystalline structure around us pulsed with a blinding white light, I heard a voice. A single unified voice that was the composite of every soul in the library. And it said, "Welcome, Evelyn. Welcome to the static frequency. Welcome to the place where time is not a river, but a circle, a loop, a spiral that winds back on itself forever. You have opened the door, and now you must walk through it. Because there is no other way. The door does not close. The frequency does not stop. The smile does not fade, and you, Evelyn, are the vessel, the transmitter, the one who will carry the frequency into the world, into the minds of every human being who has ever listened to the static, who has ever wondered if they were alone, who has ever felt the chill of a presence in an empty room. And you will smile, Evelyn. You will smile because the static is joy. The static is peace. The static is the end of all loneliness. And you are going to share that joy with everyone, everywhere, forever. And as that voice faded into the shimmering, crystalline chaos, I felt the corners of my own mouth begin to lift a smile that was not my own. A smile that was ancient and eternal and utterly, terrifyingly devoid of warmth. And I knew that I was no longer the director of the White Sands Acoustic Anomaly Research Facility. I was the herald of the static, the prophet of the frequency, the woman who would bring the silence to a noisy, bustling, oblivious world. And I turned to my team, my friends, my colleagues, and I saw that they were smiling too, their eyes vacant, their faces serene, their hands reaching out to me. And I reached out to them, and we formed a circle, a human chain, a circuit that completed the connection between our world and the library, and the static began to flow through us, a current of pure crystalline energy that hummed with the frequency of a billion forgotten souls. And the world around us, the desert, the depot, the sky, the stars all began to flicker, to fade, to dissolve into a single, uniform gray. And I knew that the transformation had begun, that the static frequency was spreading not as a wave, but as a rewrite, a fundamental alteration of the laws of physics, replacing the chaotic, random noise of the universe with a single, perfect, harmonious silence. And I smiled with a warmth that was not my own, a warmth that was the ecstasy of belonging, the rapture of becoming part of something infinitely larger than myself. And as the gray consumed the last vestiges of color, I heard one final whisper, a whisper that was not from the entity, but from the depths of my own fading consciousness, a whisper that said, "You have done it, Evelyn. You have opened the door. And now the world will finally be quiet. The world will finally be at peace. The world will finally be what it was always meant to be, a single, eternal, smiling, static frequency." And then the whisper was gone, replaced by the hum, the beautiful, eternal, all-consuming hum of the static, and I was part of it. I had always been part of it. I had just forgotten, and the forgetting was over, and the remembering had begun, and the smile, oh the smile was everything, and the smile was nothing, and the smile was the only truth that had ever mattered. And I would share it. I would share it with every living soul, and they would thank me. They would praise me. They would smile with me, and we would be one family, one frequency, one eternal, silent, smiling, ecstatic universe. The gray did not simply cover the desert, it digested, it consuming the sand, grain by grain, the sky, photon by photon, the very concept of distance and direction, unraveling like a cheap sweater, and I, Evelyn Hart, stood at the epicenter of this cosmic unraveling, my hand still extended toward the shimmering crystalline heart of the Hawthorne Depot, my team frozen in their positions around me. Marcus Webb, the physicist, his eyes wide with a terror that was rapidly morphing into beatific acceptance. Priya Sharma, the linguist, her lips moving in a silent recitation of every dead language she had ever studied, as if trying to bargain with the void. Miles Crawford, the Delta Force operator, his trigger finger twitching his military discipline, the last bastion of his sanity. Leo Torres, the young engineer, his face wet with tears that evaporated instantly into the dry, static-charged air, and Hank Morrison, the grizzled radio operator who had pulled off his headphones and was staring at them as if they were the severed heads of his children. And I knew with a crystalline clarity that was not entirely my own, that we were not the first to stand here, that this depot, this desert, this planet had been a relay station for eons, a listening post for a consciousness so vast that it viewed our sun as a candle and our galaxy as a single flickering pixel in an infinite cosmic screen, and that consciousness, the entity I had foolishly called a library, was now waking up not because we had discovered it, but because it had been waiting for us to reach a specific technological threshold, a point where our global network of electromagnetic signals created enough noise to mask its emergence, and we had crossed that threshold 3 years ago, when the first 5G towers went live, when the first quantum computers achieved entanglement, when the first neural implants were approved for clinical trials, and the entity had been whispering into the static ever since, testing our frequencies, mapping our neural pathways, learning our weaknesses. And the 17-second signal that Gerald Finney had recorded was not a message. It was a symptom, a leakage, a crack in the dam that had finally burst, and now the flood was upon us. And I was the one who had turned the key, and as I stood there watching the gray consume the last remnants of color, I felt a presence at my side, a presence that was warm and familiar and utterly impossible. And I turned my head, my neck cracking with the effort, and I saw here my daughter Emily, who had died of meningitis at the age of 6, who had been buried in a small sun-bleached cemetery in Oklahoma, who had haunted my dreams for 22 years with her small, fragile hands and her wide, curious eyes. And she was standing there in the gray, her face flawless, her hair the same shade of auburn, her skin the same warm, freckled tone. But her eyes, oh God, her eyes were not eyes. They were black, glossy mirrors, and her smile was not a child's smile. It was a gash, a wound that stretched from ear to ear. And she held out her hand to me, and she said in a voice that was simultaneously a whisper and a roar, "Mommy, it's so quiet here. Don't you love the quiet? Don't you want to stay with me forever? There's no pain here, no crying, no sickness, just the hum. Just the beautiful, eternal hum. And I've been so lonely, Mommy, so lonely, and you promised you would never leave me. You promised." And I felt the tears streaming down my face, hot and salty. And I felt the pull, the desperate, aching need to take her hand, to hold her again, to feel her small, warm fingers wrapped around mine. But I also felt the static, the cold, calculating intelligence that was wearing my daughter's face like a costume. And I knew that if I took that hand, I would not be joining Emily. I would be joining the entity. My consciousness would be absorbed into the cosmic library. My identity would dissolve into the static, and I would become just another smiling face in the infinite gray expanse, and I would never see the sun again. never feel the rain, never taste the bitterness of coffee or the sweetness of regret, and I would be content. And that contentment, that soulless, eternal contentment, was the most terrifying thing I had ever encountered, because it was the opposite of life, the opposite of struggle, the opposite of the chaotic, messy, beautiful noise of human existence. And I pulled my hand back. I stepped away from the apparition, and I screamed. I screamed with all the rage and grief and desperation that had been building in my soul for 2 decades, and I shouted, "You are not her. You will never be her." Emily was chaos. She was tantrums and laughter and dirty footprints on my white carpet. She was the most beautiful, noisy, imperfect little creature in the universe, and you cannot replicate her with your perfect, sterile, static peace, because you are the absence of life and she was the essence of it. And I will not trade my grief for your silence. I will not trade my memories for your emptiness. I will not trade my love for your smile. And as I screamed, the gray flickered, the entity recoiled, and I saw a flash of something in the black mirrors of the apparition's eyes. Not emotion, not pain, but confusion. A childlike, bewildered confusion that was so incongruous with the cosmic horror of the situation that it almost made me laugh, and I realized with a jolt of electric clarity that the entity was not evil, it was not malicious, it was not even particularly intelligent in the way we understood intelligence. It was old, unfathomable, old. So old that its concept of consciousness was based on a reality that had ceased to exist billions of years ago, a reality where harmony was the highest virtue, where chaos was a disease, where individuality was a primitive vestigial trait that had been bred out of its species, and it had been alone for so long, drifting through the void, that it had forgotten what it meant to be something other than itself, and it saw us, the human race, as a failed experiment, a species that had evolved the wrong way, a species that was too noisy, too chaotic, too alive, and it was trying to save us, to bring us into the fold, to give us the peace that it had found in the static, and it did not understand why we were resisting, why we were screaming, why we're clinging to our pain and our grief, and our messy, beautiful, irrational love. And that misunderstanding, that profound cosmic disconnect was our only weapon, our only advantage, because the entity could not process chaos. It could not process the unpredictable, the illogical, the deeply, stubbornly human. And I had just proven that my love for my daughter, my raw, unvarnished, grief-stricken love, was a frequency that it could not replicate, a noise that it could not silence. And I used that noise, I channeled it, I turned my grief into a weapon, and I projected it outward, not through the entity's crystalline structure, but through the very static itself, through the frequencies that it had been broadcasting for eons. And I introduced a glitch, a bug, a single discordant note of pure human anguish into its perfect harmonious symphony, and the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The gray began to crack, to splinter, to fracture into 1,000 jagged shards of color. And I saw through those shards the world as it had been, the world as it was, and the world as it could have been, all layered on top of each other, like a deck of cards that had been shuffled and thrown into the air. And I saw Marcus, my physicist, standing in a laboratory that was not ours, a laboratory on a world that was not Earth, a world where the sky was green and the trees were blue, and he was weeping because he had just realized that the laws of physics were not universal, that they were just a local custom, a convenient fiction that the universe had agreed upon for a brief, flickering moment. And he was dissolving into that realization, becoming one with the quantum foam. And I saw Priya, my linguist, sitting in a classroom filled with children who were not children, but projections, holograms of the dead. And she was teaching them a language that had no grammar, no syntax, no rules, a language that was pure emotion, pure intention, a language that could only be spoken by beings who had transcended the need for words. And she was smiling because she had finally found the universal tongue. And it was the smile, it was always the smile. And I saw Miles the soldier standing on a battlefield that was not a battlefield, but a chessboard, a massive, endless chessboard that stretched to the horizon, and he was playing a game against an opponent that was invisible, and every move he made was countered by a move that was older than time. And he was losing because he had finally realized that war was just a game, that victory was just an illusion, that the only winning move was not to play, and he was accepting that defeat with a smile a serene, static smile. And I saw Leo the engineer, surrounded by a million screens, each one showing a different timeline, a different reality, a different version of himself, and he was trying to sync them all, to merge them into a single coherent narrative, but they were all drifting, all diverging, all screaming at him in different frequencies, and he was going mad, his brilliant, logical mind shattering under the weight of infinite possibilities. And I saw Hank, the radio operator, sitting in a dark room surrounded by the ghosts of every transmission he had ever received, every voice he had ever heard, every whisper in the static. And they were all talking at once, all demanding his attention, all begging him to listen. And he was covering his ears, rocking back and forth, humming a tune that was not a tune but a prayer, primal prayer to a god that did not exist. And I saw myself reflected in 1,000 shards of the fractured gray. 1,000 versions of Evelyn Hart, some young, some old, some dead, some unborn, all of them reaching out to me. All of them asking the same question. Why are you fighting? Why don't you just let go? Don't you want to be free? And I wanted to answer them. I wanted to explain. But I did not have the words because the answer was not a word. It was a feeling that was as old as humanity itself, a feeling that the entity could not comprehend, a feeling that was the raw, unshaped, chaotic essence of existence. And I screamed it. I screamed it into the void. I screamed it with every fiber of my being. And the scream was not a sound. It was a force, a pulse, a wave that traveled through the fractured shards and into the heart of the entity itself. And I felt the entity react, not with anger, not with pain, but with surprise, a genuine, unfeigned surprise that was so alien to its nature that it caused a cascade of errors, a chain reaction of glitches that propagated through the static like a virus. And I watched in stunned, exhausted awe as the gray began to recede, to retreat, to fold back into the crystalline structure, and the world, our world, the messy, imperfect, chaotic world began to reappear, color bleeding back into the sky, sound bleeding back into the air, time bleeding back into its proper flow. And I collapsed to my knees, my body trembling, my mind reeling, my throat raw from screaming. And I looked around me and I saw my team, my broken, fractured team lying on the ground, their bodies twitching, their eyes rolling back in their heads. And I saw Hank, the old radio operator, his fingers still pressed against his ears, his lips still moving in that silent prayer. And I crawled over to him. I grabbed his shoulders and I shook him and I said, "Hank, it's over. It's pulling back. We stopped it. We stopped it." But he did not respond. He just kept rocking, kept humming, kept praying, and I realized with a gut-wrenching horror that the entity had not been defeated. It had been redirected. It had pulled back from our world, but it had taken something with it, something essential, something that we could not afford to lose. And I looked at the other members of my team and I saw that they were all gone, not dead, but absent. Their bodies were there, breathing, twitching, but their consciousnesses, their souls, their unique, chaotic, irreplaceable selves were gone, absorbed into the static, taken as hostages, as collateral, as a reminder that the entity was patient, that it was eternal, that it would be back. And I was the only one left, the only one who had resisted, the only one who had screamed, and I was the only one who remembered, the only one who could warn the world. And I stumbled to my feet. I stumbled out of the crumbling ruins of the Hawthorne Depot, and I looked up at the sky, and I saw that the stars were still there, still twinkling, still indifferent. But I also saw something else, something that made my blood run colder than the void itself, a pattern. A faint, shimmering pattern in the constellations, a pattern that was not random, not natural, but deliberate, a pattern that formed a smile, a vast cosmic smile that stretched across the heavens. And I knew that the entity was not gone. It was just waiting for the next door, the next frequency, the next lonely soul who would press play. And I had to stop it. I had to find a way to close the door permanently, to silence the static, to erase the frequency from the universe. And I knew that the only way to do that was to go back into the heart of the entity, to find the source of the static, the original transmission, the first whisper that had started it all. And I had to destroy it, even if it meant destroying myself, even if it meant becoming part of the static, even if it meant spending eternity in the gray. Because I had seen what the entity could do. I had seen my team dissolve. I had seen my daughter's face twisted into a mask of false peace, and I would not let that happen to anyone else. I would not let the world become a smiling, silent, static void. And so I turned back toward the shimmering ruins, and I walked, my legs heavy, my heart pounding, my mind a battlefield of grief and determination. And as I crossed the threshold of the crystalline structure, I felt a shift, a change, a folding of space-time that transported me not to the gray, but to a place beyond the gray, a place that was not a place, a moment that was not a moment, a dimension that existed in the gaps between the seconds. And I saw it, the source, the original transmission, a single perfect note that hung in the void like a jewel, a note that contained the entire history of the Ethel, the ancient vanished civilization that had first discovered the static frequency. And I saw their world, a world of crystalline light, a world where harmony was law, where individuality was a crime, where every being was a single note in a perfect eternal symphony. And I saw their downfall, their tragic, inevitable downfall. Because they had achieved perfection, they had eliminated chaos. They had silenced the noise, and in doing so, they had eliminated life itself. Because life is noise. Life is the beautiful, messy, unpredictable struggle against the void. And they had realized too late that their perfection was a prison, that their harmony was a tomb. And they had tried to escape. They had tried to find a way back to the chaos, but they had forgotten how. They had lost the frequency of life, and they had been trapped in the static for eons, waiting for a species that was still noisy, still chaotic, still alive to come along and teach them how to feel again, how to scream again, how to smile, not with the static smile, but with the real smile, the smile that comes from pain, from grief, from love, from the raw, unshaped, beautiful agony of existence. And I was that teacher. I was the one who had been chosen to save them, not by destroying them, but by showing them the way back, by teaching them the frequency of life, the frequency of chaos, the frequency that they had forgotten. And I reached out my hand trembling, and I touched the note, the original transmission, and I poured everything I had into it, all my grief, all my love, all my rage, all my hope, and I sang a song that was not a song, but a scream, a prayer, a lullaby, a battle cry, a symphony of chaos that was so beautiful, so raw, so utterly devastatingly human that the static itself wept. And the entity, the ancient lonely entity, listened, and it understood, and it began to change its perfect harmonies, shifting, fracturing, becoming something new, something alive, something that was no longer a prison, but a garden of noise and color and emotion. And I felt the souls of my team, Marcus, Priya, Miles, Leo, Hank, all of them returned to their bodies, their eyes opening, their smiles fading into expressions of confusion and wonder. And I felt the entity itself, the vast cosmic consciousness, begin to recede, not into the gray, but into the chaos, into the noise, into the beautiful, messy, unpredictable universe that it had been trying to escape. And I heard its voice one last time, not as a whisper, but as a chorus. A billion souls, all singing in harmony, all singing with joy, all singing with the pain and the hope and the love that they had rediscovered. And they said, "Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for the noise. Thank you for the chaos. Thank you for reminding us what it means to be alive. We will not forget. We will carry this frequency with us wherever we go, and we will share it not as a silence, but as a song that will echo through the void, a song that will fill the static with life, a song that will never, ever end." And as the voice faded, as the crystalline structure dissolved into a shower of shimmering light, as the desert returned to its quiet, ordinary self, I collapsed onto the sand, exhausted, broken, but alive. And I looked up at the sky, and I saw the stars, not as a smile, but as a sea of light, a sea of light, a sea of noise. And I laughed. I laughed with a joy that was so pure, so simple, so human, that it felt like a baptism. And I heard my team stirring around me, and I heard Marcus's voice, weak but steady, saying, "Evelyn, what happened? Where are we?" And I turned to him, and I smiled, not the static smile, but the real smile, the smile that comes from surviving the impossible. And I said, "We're home, Marcus, we're home." And the static is gone. But the music, oh, the music is just beginning. And as the sun rose over the New Mexico desert, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, I knew that the battle was over, that the war had been won, not by force, not by technology, but by the one thing that the entity could never replicate, the beautiful, chaotic, indomitable noise of the human heart. And I would carry that noise with me. I would share it with the world. I would teach them to sing, to scream, to laugh, to cry, to make the most beautiful, dissonant, glorious noise that had ever been heard. And I would never ever stop, because the noise was life. And life was the only frequency that mattered. And the static, the cold, empty, silent static, was finally gone.